Okay, hello once again. This is my fourth and final part of the presentation I'm giving on strain localization and fracture of nuclear reactor materials, power reactor materials in particular. So in this part, I'm going to move on a little bit, talk a little bit about SCC and DHC. I omitted to mention at the beginning of the whole presentations that I'm not going to be talking too much about SCC and DHC because I'm mostly concerned with the material properties from radiation, and for SCC, which is stress corrosion cracking in particular, that is covered very widely, has been covered very widely by many different people over the years, and I'm taking the advantage here of telling you about things that perhaps you haven't heard about, things that I would have been exposed to, and I can share that experience with you. So just to make sure I cover the topics, I'm going to talk a little bit about SCC and DHC, what's similar about them, and I'll talk a bit about radiation embrittlement, which hides a plethora of sins. It could be helium embrittlement, could be just straight irradiation embrittlement. Then I want to talk about crack localization with some examples and case studies. Basically, the situation and the circumstances when we get intergranular and intragranular. Intra mean within the grain, or transgranular cracking, as opposed to intergranular cracking, and intergranular cracking being at the grain boundary. So many of you might be familiar with DHC, and you probably are if you come from the zirconium community. And hydrogen is probably the worst thing for zirconium in terms of the fracture properties. And zirconium suffers from what's known as delayed hydride cracking. What happens, you have a flaw, a cracked tip, such as one shown here, and you get hydrogen will nucleate at the crack. Lots of theories, lots of models to explain how the hydrogen get there. The most widely known related to basically a stress gradient. So you're pulling in, you're bringing in more hydrogen. Because of the stress, it diffuses in response to the stress to the crack tip, and then precipitates there because it's supersaturated. So the DHC itself, when you conduct a test, typically you have a certain flaw size, and you'll get the cracking going, and what the guys will do is that they'll reduce the load until it stops. And at that point, they know that they've found this edge, this what's called the initiation point, the K1H. So given the stress and the dimensions of the flaw at that point, they can calculate what the stress intensity factor is, K1H, and then they'll start to raise the load and get back into cracking. So, of course, the stable crack growth is dependent on the crack itself, the size of the crack, but also on the rate at which hydrogen gets there. So, in terms of a crack velocity, it cracks at a certain rate. So once you get cracking going at a certain load, it'll accelerate, or eventually accelerate, as the crack exceeds its critical crack length. Schematically, what you have is you have a flaw. You have to have a flaw for hydride cracking to occur, delayed hydride cracking to occur. Hydrogen diffused to the crack tip, you get a larger hydride precipitated here. You might get other reprecipitated hydrides depending on the stress field around the crack tip. And then once the hydride gets to a certain size, certain dimensions, I guess you have to be an expert on fraction mechanics to deduce what that size should be. Again, lots of models to apply here, but suffice to say that once the hydride gets to a certain size, it breaks. So it presumably, I don't know what the reason is, but you just have to know that empirically the hydride will break once it reaches a certain size. It cracks in a brittle manner, and then the crack advances, and then you can get more the hydride processing. The hydriding process can start again. It seems that stress corrosion cracking follows somewhat similar velocity K1H or KH curve, exactly the same. Below a certain stress or stress intensity, you don't get any action, but once you exceed a certain stress intensity, that's a combination of the stress and the crack dimensions, the thing can start progressing, and at a slow rate and slow strain rate test, you get a crack velocity. So just like with delayed hydride cracking, the issue with stress corrosion cracking is what is the point at where we initiate, if we're in a condition where we've exceeded initiation, and then once you're in initiation, what is the rate, how quickly does it progress, and eventually the thing that you want to avoid is actually getting into the critical crack length point where the material will just crack anyway, catastrophically. So hydride cracking and SCC are slightly different in that the hydride cracking relies on diffusion of hydrogen to the crack tip from within the material, whereas in the case of SCC, it can either happen intergranularly or transgranularly, and most theories rely on the fact that you get some oxide buildup ahead of the crack tip in the material, and this oxide comes from, basically from the environment, from oxidation at the crack tip, again from the environment, depending on what the coolant chemistry is and everything. So the difference is with hydride cracking, delayed hydride cracking, the hydrogen comes from within the material, and with SCC, it comes from not hydrogen necessarily, but oxidation, some product, something that's going to fail in a brittle manner, comes from outside, from the environment. Here's it's a schematic produced by Fukuya, 2013. This was I should have put the full reference here, but 2013. It's a paper also on strain localization, if I recall correctly. And hypothetically, there's all kinds of things going on in an irradiation environment. In terms of irradiation-assisted stress corrosion cracking, you're damaging the material, you're hardening it, and you've got radiolysis also to contend with. But the thing that's of interest in terms of strain localization, a lot of the models, a lot of the mindset when it comes to determine what the mechanism is of irradiation-assisted stress corrosion cracking, there seems to be a strong focus not just on the hardening effect of irradiation, but on the softening effect of these bands, these you call them shear bands. We've talked about this, what we know as channels. Unfortunately, what gets published is often very ambiguous. People represent channels as this nice array, a row of dislocations in a cleaned out channel. As I mentioned previously, first you have to clean out the channel, and hopefully there's no hardening going on. There's nothing no tangles, there's nothing impeding the dislocations if you then want to have these dislocations marching along and creating a stress intensity at the point where they butt up against a boundary. So it's all well and good to hypothesize and speculate, but often in many of the papers that get published, this kind of gray area. I mean, people are not very specific about exactly what happens here and what's going on. Okay, but they do like dislocation channeling and GB and grain boundary interactions. That seems to be a very popular mechanism for explanation of a radiation-assisted stress corrosion cracking. Another way that radiation affects stress corrosion cracking that is needs to be considered is sensitization, that is chromium depletion. I should have mentioned that in the delayed hydride cracking case, there is an effect of radiation. It's well known, lots of work to show that when the material is irradiated, especially if it's irradiated at a lowish temperature where in a Candy reactor it amounts to higher damage density, when you have that situation, the DHC rate increases. And again, there's lots of speculation about that relates to the size of the plastic zone at the head of a crack tip. So the smaller it is, it seems that the quicker the DHC progresses. Okay, I forgot to mention that. That's why I mention it now. So anyway, sensitization at IASCC. So this, because we're talking about sensitization, this is now specific to steels and nickel alloys. And in principle, what happens is that if you have a grain boundary and you deplete the chromium in the region close to the boundary, either because of carbide precipitation or by some other means, then you can reduce the chromium level to below the level at which it would be an effective oxidation retardant, and you can get some either dissolution or oxidation of the material in this volume. So if you have some mechanism which is depleting the chrome at the grain boundary, whether it be carbide precipitation or simply some radiation enhanced diffusion or induced diffusion, then that would be one way to link the enhancement of stress corrosion cracking with radiation. So there's been quite a bit of work on this. Here's a summary of some results from reported by Gary Wass, showing that with increasing dose, the amount of sensitization, the sensitization increases because the chromium decreases. Now, Gary chose to call this radiation-induced diffusion. I'm not sure that that's the correct term. And he's talking about steels which, judging by the chromium composition here at the beginning of a radiation, presumably we're looking at basically a non-heat treated condition. So basically it's solution annealed in many cases. It looks like, although I don't know what these are, HP or CP or whatever. But just by looking at the chromium the composition at zero dose, it seems that there hasn't been much evidence of any chromium depletion in the as received material. But with time in the reactor, the chromium depletion drops down. So the reason I question Gary calling it radiation induced, because from my perspective, I would have said, well, what about radiation enhanced diffusion? So if you look at the conditions that apply in a PWR, and you work out what the vacancy concentration is, one can see that in a particular PWR environment, given some assumptions about the point defect concentration, not the concentration, the microstructure, both whether it's cavities or, well, not cavities, but just dislocations and the grain boundaries, one can calculate what the steady state vacancy concentration is. And if you have a high density of defects, if you like, then the diffusion certainly is elevated. Actually, the diffusion is more elevated the fewer sinks you have. So although I've drawn this here with cavities, that has to do with the case for Inconel, but we're looking at the dotted line here. So ostensibly, if we're in a reactor, if we're somewhere down here at 300 degrees C, the effective irradiation in a PWR is to elevate the self-diffusion coefficient, because you've simply increased the steady state vacancy concentration up to these levels, which corresponds roughly with about 550 degrees C. So no cavities in reactor, typical coal work structure. It's as if you're, in terms of self-diffusion, it's as if you have, you're holding the material at 500 degrees C or 550 degrees C. And under those conditions, 550 degrees C, it would only take 1 month in a PWR to start precipitating. This is a TTT diagram for the carbides in austenitic stainless steel. I think it's 304. Anyway, this is, I should look up the reference for this, but basically what's happening is that it's easy to see that you only need a couple of months to start to precipitate carbon and to start depleting the chromium at the grain boundary. And so I would be more inclined to say this is potentially a radiation enhanced effect, not induced. So support for the notion that the radiation might be due to carbide precipitation comes from the work of Fournier et al. They did some ion irradiations, and they looked at the effect of varying amounts of alloying elements, platinum, hafnium, and looked at what effect that had on the segregation, the depletion of chromium at grain boundaries during proton irradiation. And what was interesting is how they described the effect. They described the spectacular effect of hafnium in suppressing depletion of chromium at grain boundaries. And when I read that, I thought, oh, that's not a surprise, because hafnium's a carbide former. So it struck me that perhaps, I don't know for sure, but perhaps the fact that they have hafnium in there, the hafnium gathers the carbon, and the chromium is basically left in its normal state. It's not preferentially depleted. So I would hazard a guess that the particular relationship with hafnium is important because because hafnium is a carbide former. Okay, enough of stress corrosion cracking and delayed hydride cracking. Let's move on and get on to the other aspect of a radiation particular phenomena, which is basically linked to cracking, and that is channeling. Oh, somehow that's not worked. This should have been coming in afterwards, so it's unfortunate. What you would see here, if it wasn't covered up, is this is an extract from some work by Carl Stevenson and Gary Wass, where they're relating high SCC with irradiated enhanced stress corrosion cracking with the number of channels that they observe, and they relate that through the number of protrusions that they see at the grain boundary, sorry, at a surface. And they have an idea that it's unfortunate it's behind here, that the channels intersecting a grain boundary help promote crack initiation and transmission down a grain boundary. And the idea is that these channels, what are ambiguously called channels, are sites for increased stress, although it's not clear exactly what stress we're talking about. Although, if you have a planar band of dislocations and there's a pileup, then you do get some enhancement of the stress, of the shear stress at the point where the pileup happens. But if you've got a whole bunch of dislocations, one on top of the other, pileup like this, they're going to cancel. The strain field is going to cancel. So the broader strain field is not going to be realized. So again, this is kind of like a speculative mechanism, which frankly I'm not too keen on. So the propensity for IASC was linked to the density and height of shear band extrusions at the surface of the deformed materials. So quite apart from whether that's feasible or not, in their case, are the dislocation what they call dislocation channels, or are they twins? Now, they showed some examples of extrusions on the surface where channels exited the surface, and they look just like many other examples I've seen where it's twins intersecting the surface. So one has to be careful unless one's done the analysis to prove that we're dealing with a twin as opposed to a dislocation channel. It becomes difficult to pin your hat on any particular mechanism. Quite apart from anything, as I explained in part 2, when you have a channel, what is classically a channel, the dislocations climb, they don't stay on one plane. So one of the first things you have to do is create the channel, clear out the damage. Exactly what happens to the dislocations in the channel when they get to the boundary, I don't know. I would imagine they'll form a tangled mess, and I cannot imagine having the conditions for something like a straw type crack. So it becomes very uncertain exactly what the mechanism would be, and I'm not convinced, and for me the jury is out. And here's an example of what I was talking about. So here's some work from a colleague of mine, Puyan Changizian, who did some very nice work at Queen's, showing how looking at Inconel X750, you do some helium implantation. We want to simulate what goes on with Inconel X750 in the CANDU reactor. And what Puyan found was that there was many steps on the surface, and these he could unequivocally associate with twins. So steps, twins, okay. He could show that they were twins, and there was a one-to-one correlation between the twinning and the channeling. I should mention that this particular study submitted for publication still hasn't been published yet. It's in Materialia. No, it's not Materialia. It's Materials Characterization. Materialia, like the Materialia, they turned it down. Anyway, just to note that the material in the as received state was annealed bar stock X750 with some implantation. The strength increased and your ductility dropped, which is what one would expect with helium implanted to these kind of levels. And basically, it's basically a representation of what one can expect in Inconel spaces in the Candu reactor at a fairly low dose, something like up to 10 dPa, for example. So this is what we expect, and this is corresponding increase in the strength, and we haven't got to the point where it decreases again with higher helium concentrations yet. So just to reiterate, the defects that were shown by in that previous slide by Puyen, again this didn't work either, was nice and straight. I could analyze them as twins using diffraction. From my perspective, I wouldn't even care with, I would be 90% certain that certain defects were twins just simply from the contrast and the shape. Again, just to reiterate, channels are typically a little bit messy. You might get some residual dislocations. The edges will be ragged where you haven't had complete elimination of the cavities, and the channels themselves are never straight. So it's, to me, there's very little ambiguity between what is a twin and a channel, and frankly, I'm amazed at the amount of publications I read and people refer to things that look like twins but call them channels. And I'm going to show you an example of this in a minute. So why is this important? Why do we care about this sort of thing? Well, care because there are certain claims that have been made in various areas, and people seem to go along with it. And one in particular has to do with transgranular fracture. So Frank Garner came up with this notion that in a highly irradiated stainless steel, whatever dose that is, dPa times 5. So it's a 50 dPa here. So 50 dPa and whatever the helium concentration is, although it's EBR2, even though it was EBR2, they saw lots of cavities, and because they saw shearing of the cavities, which ostensibly is from twinning, but the fact that I mentioned this earlier, it seems to be a much larger strain than you would get from a single twinning operation. So that's kind of peculiar. Not quite sure what's going on there. But because they saw this shearing, and that's a separate issue, whether the shearing is from twinning or whether it's from some other mechanism. But irrespective of that, there was a link made then, this must relate eventually to a crack formation, and that leads to transgranular cracking, as we see here. I think also in one of Frank's publications, he believed that the depletion of nickel in some areas will result in the formation of a a martensite phase, which again is total speculation. So I think there's another explanation for this in this particular case, and that is that there are platelet-like precipitates in many austenitic alloys. So again, here's an example from Inconel 750 again, where we also saw transgranular cracking, and Puyan did a really good job on showing examples where the cracking was observed at its early stages in a tensile specimen. So this is tested to high strains and high stresses, but in terms of the cracking itself, it tends to follow where we have these platelets, these twin martensite platelets. So Puyan had already analyzed them, and again, I apologize for the ambiguity here, even though I'm complaining about it. There is some ambiguity sometimes, because sometimes they have this evidence of a martensite phase, and then sometimes it's evidence of just a twin phase. And that seems to be generic amongst many different reports of the microstructures in steels, that you get this mixture of twin and martensite platelets, epsilon martensite platelets. Doesn't surprise me, frankly, because if you they're both shear mechanisms, they're both bulk shears, and in the one case you get half the amount of strain as the other. So the martensite gives you half the strain, but it's still essentially a very similar mechanism. So why do I think that this then lies to what Frank described as channel fracture? Well, here's an example of a micrograph from the same from the original work with Hamilton, where Frank is talking about channel fracture, and they were able to show in some of the archive material. Now it's archive material, not the irradiated material, so it's easy to miss in the irradiated material because all kinds of stuff's going on. It's very difficult, but you may find that in some grains you have lots of these platelets. So they did see this in some archive material. So if you see one example in an unirradiated case, I think it's a fairly highly likely that you're going to come across this kind of thing at some point in one of your irradiated samples. And judging by the work that from Puyan, it looks like that's sampling a weak point, and you're going to see fracture where you have those platelets. So here's just for comparison, here's some of the Puyan's stuff again, and Puyan had taken the trouble to diligently analyze using diffraction, but also you can just see that you have a contrast change here, and in all likelihood that's a twin. You know, I would be willing to bet $100 that that's a twin without even doing any diffraction analysis, just simply because of the way it looks. So Frank coined this phrase channel fracture, which may or may not be valid in terms of attributing it to shear of cavities. I highly doubt it. You can attribute it to the shear of cavities. But there are cases where, and probably this is what's on Frank's mind, there are cases where shearing of cavities does go with fracture. This is in very high density cavity situations. But this is generally not a planar thing. In this particular case, this is Parolo. The cracking is actually along the boundary, and there seems to be a higher density of cavities along some interface here. Hard to say. I would have said that's intergranular probably. But there are other examples where the crack takes a normal zigzag type pattern, and as you would expect from a normal ductile failure. But the very fact that you've got these ligaments, thinner ligaments between the cavities, it's not hard to accept that you're going to get some preferential ductile deformation there, and eventually you'll get the ligament failure between certain cavities when they have a certain density. So the key observation that Francana made when it came to channel fracture was this one, and there are two aspects of it. Oh, actually, this is Fish and Stralson. These were precursors to what to Frank. Frank said the same thing, but these guys looked at these material where they saw these flat, faceted fractures in their steel samples, but they also noticed in the same sample that they had these bands, if you like, of sheared cavities. Now, you can jump to conclusions and say, they're related, or you can not jump to conclusions and say, why are they related? So then the intellectual leap came from, well, if this is, look at the amount of shearing, we got like 100% here, which would have been a 45-degree angle as opposed to 70-degree angle, 70% strain. Sorry, this is a 45-degree angle as opposed to 35-degree angle. So basically, they surmise that perhaps these things coalesce and create a sharp crack. Yeah, I don't know, no evidence for it, and it was assumed that these channels were dislocation channels. So not only do you have a situation where this is a bulk shear, it then gets conflated with the planar shear of many dislocations all on one plane that would have to precede the actual creation of an overlap of cavities from shearing of dislocations on one slip plane. So the very fact that even in a channel you have dislocations which climb as they sweep up the loops, and then they're going on various possible planes, you end up, that's the reason why we end up, even with a channel, perhaps a bulk shear, but this could also be a twin. And actually, if it was two twins, you would not see the outcome. You'd not see the twin material, because the first twin would go through, shear the cavities, and then let's say another twin comes through in the same volume. It'll return the crystal back to its original condition, but give the cavities an extra shear. So that would be my bet if it turned out that there was no twin here when this was tilted to the right conditions. In other cases, Oak Ridge, Jim Bentley worked with Linda Horton here. Or Jim's not on this, but I know he would be advising here. Again, similar kind of shearing observed, but they in this particular case they analyzed these volumes and equated the shearing to twinning. And I assume that they did the analysis, otherwise why would they call it a twin? So we have this assumption about no twins, some kind of strange dislocation slip mechanism which gives you a bulk shear, which could be channeling, but why would it then create cracks? Who knows? But ultimately the bulk shear is equivalent to a twin, and an actual twinning. So irrespective, however you look at it, whatever creates this, it's a bulk shear, and under those circumstances, it's very unlikely that you're going to get one cavity being sheared and then and moved on top of another one, or so that you increase coalescence and somehow get some stress intensity, well, a crack formation. Highly unlikely. I don't think so. So why is this important? Well, in the Candu case, in the last 5 years, we had this one example where there was some micromechanical testing going on, and it was noticed that the cracking was observed, and it was correlated with a feature in the microstructure. Now, the guys who did the analysis called this a slip band or a dislocation channel, without defining exactly how cracking could occur along a slip band. I mean, if this was a slip band in the classical sense of a slice through a slip plane, there are two things. A, it wouldn't show this contrast, that you wouldn't see any contrast change. I mean, this looks like there's a different tilt here. And B, the edges of a slip plane are artificial. They just, it's where the projected image of the slip plane is as it intersects the foil surface. So it's not a real thing. So the implication is that this is a real thing, whatever it is, a platelet of some kind, I would hazard a guess. I mean, I did at the time. So the microtensile test was deliberately in this kind of mode of imaging because it shows up the cavities easier. But what that does is that you end up with kind of poor contrast conditions, and you don't really know what you're looking at. Except they did did interpret this as a slip plane or slip band, whatever that means. And I remember at the meeting I said, well, that doesn't look like it. And look at and then they even admitted there was a tilt involved, so that there was some just like with the Zhao and Was case, there was an actual tilt of the crystal. And again, maybe you have a string of dislocations all of one side, which effectively would make a subgrain boundary along one edge, even if this wasn't itself crystallographically tilting the sample. I mean, who knows? There's any number of explanations, but the slip band explanation just didn't make sense. Unfortunately, the group at Chalk River now, and more recent, a couple of years ago, went back to this case study and tilted the sample so it was in good diffraction context. And this is the structure that was there. And it was identified as a cluster, an accumulation, agglomeration of twin, microtwins. So this vague thing here along which the cracking was observed is actually a cluster of microtwins. So it begs the question, well, it's not a slip band, and this is microtwins. So on the one hand, in 1 year they're reporting this, and then the next time they're reporting on it, it's a set of microtwins. So I'm not sure what the conclusions would be from the group that did this work now. It's a bulk platelet-like structure, and it's a complex agglomeration of twin martensite platelets. And it's along the edge of this structure where you get the cracking. And these are the two reports where in this case this was described as a slip band. In this case they described it as a cluster of nanotwins, but they're the same volume of material, they're the same feature. So the cracking along the nanotwin platelets is understandable because that's what Pouyan Changissian observed in his work at Queen's. One other feature of the work that you have to dig into the micrographs a little bit more is that this feature ran right the way through the material, across the grain, and you could see where there was a high propensity for cracking in this microtensile twist. And again, they related this to shearing of the cavities creating cracks somehow, and even described this edge component as the shearing of the cavities from dislocation slip. And again, it doesn't make any sense because a slip band has an edge to it, but that's an artifact of how the sample was prepared. And at the same time, this isn't a 1-1-1 slip plane. Here you see a shear band which as we've described, it could be twinning or it could be an actual dislocation band on multiple different planes because of the climb of the dislocations, but it's not aligned with this feature. So crystallographically, in my experience, when they don't share the same plane and you're talking the same mechanism, one of them is wrong. And the very fact that it's bent is a good indication that no, this is a cluster of platelets, and it has a certain it's an inhomogeneity, and it's naturally that it's going to fail there ultimately. So I mentioned there that this top feature here shows that shearing, and again that's okay. I mean, that can be a twin or it could be a shear band, a dislocation channel. Who knows? They'd have to do a bit more work, I think, to establish one way or the other what it is. But the feature of import, the one that's important, is this one where we have the cracking, and it has nothing to do with this. It has no relationship. So again, we look at Pouyan's work. And more recently, he did two pieces of work. One was on some bar stock material, and then the other was material that was fabricated to replicate the fabrication history of Inconel spacers. So a little bit more cold work, different kind of heat treatments. And then Pouyan did the helium implantation and did the testing. And in the as received material, it was kind of mostly ductile. There may be some planar features where you might have some cracking along these precipitates and platelets. But when it was irradiated, it very much was a very brittle failure, and it was either intergranular and transgranular. But the transgranular features, some of it was flat, and then some of it was like this. So again, if we imagine that these, I hate to say that, if we imagine that these things are those platelets, or twin platelets, or twin martensite platelets, or even clusters of twin martensite platelets, in this case, they seem to be intersecting the grain boundary. I should point out, these were present from fabrication. They weren't induced by either testing or by irradiation. They're present from fabrication. And if you have some which are intersecting the fracture surface, you get these little steps, like not steps, but walls being created. So basically, clearly, you've got preferential fracture along the edge of these features. And in some cases, if these features were parallel with the plane of the fracture, they'd look flatter, of course. I mean, the whole region would look flat. So here we have some nice strong evidence for the formation of cracks at the twin martensite interfaces. And then went and looked a little bit further, did some TEM on the samples, and lo and behold, again, using this absorption contrast mode where you're looking for the contrast from the cavities and not the contrast from the structure, the twin or whatever it is that you're looking at, some complex structure. And what he saw was that clearly here you had some shearing going on. And again, you can argue that, well, maybe that's twinning or maybe it's dislocations. But one of the arguments for dislocations is that there's such a high strain, there's such a very large shearing going on here that it can't be a twin operation. Well, no, it can't be a single twin operation, but there's nothing stopping having multiple twin operations in the same volume. I mean, why not? especially if it's especially if you're close to the surface and it's unconstrained. Again, still needs some further work perhaps, but in this case, Puyen identified this as a twin. Now, if you're doing multiple twin operations, obviously it has to be an odd number. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to identify it as a twin. It would just be something, a band of material with some sheared cavities. If you have an even number of twins, because you return it back to its original in register with the matrix, so you wouldn't be able to tell. But another feature that Puyen noted was that in some of the pre-existing stuff, and we know it's pre-existing because it contains helium bubbles even within the boundaries of the feature. And I know from we have to read the paper to see that this is actually a complex structure, complex twin structure. But one of the things that Puyen noted, not necessarily in this one, but in one of the undeformed samples, was that there was a layer of martensite along the edge. And what was observed is that even though this was a pre-existing platelet structure, it seems to have exhibited additional shearing during the tensile testing. So that's kind of an interesting observation, and it just complicates things even more. And the fact that there were some platelets where there was a band of martensite at the edge of the twin is an even more it complicates it even more. So lots to study, lots of interesting stuff, and yeah, there's probably a couple of PhDs worth of material floating around in that realm. I think we're almost finished now. Just to again finish off on that theme, one of the things that Puyen was interested in was whether you're getting segregation along these platelets of cavities. It turns out that even in the neutron irradiated case, transgranular fracture, when it's observed, and it is observed in a small number of cases, it can certainly be associated with the segregation of cavities along the interface. So here's some twins or something like that. I don't think there was any detailed study here performed, and this is from actually Colin Judge's thesis, and from McMaster, and this is so you have these segregation of helium bubbles at the twin interface. That would make these interfaces just the same as grain boundaries. So if you're seeing intergranular failure because of the helium segregation, why not get failure of what are likely incoherent twins? I mean, the fact that they're not very straight, you can see here that they have different widths here, that these are incoherent to a large extent. So, I mean, it makes perfect sense that that is one of the explanations. So, just to conclude, strain localization, whether at a crack tip or in shear bands, is a precursor to fracture of reactor materials. In unirradiated material, localization is commonly observed as necking in tensile test. And irradiation-induced defects, whether they're loops or bubbles perforating a grain boundary, promote localization in nuclear reactor materials during service. That's about it. Okay, thank you.